Ladies and gentlemen, you're very, very welcome to this, the first lecture in the 18th series. Tonight, our first speaker in this series is Margaret O'Sullivan, who comes from Nina. And Margaret is an expert on local history. And with her grandfather being Tim Looney of Cahir, I don't think there's any surprise that she is. I think she was probably bred, born and reared into history amongst other things. Now Margaret herself, as she said, was born in Nina. She is currently coming to the end of her PhD studies in UL. Tonight her subject is William Rochfort, who was the last land agent in County Tipperary. So without further ado, we welcome Margaret to the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mary. The title of my lecture tonight is Tipperary's last land agent. He wasn't, of course, the last land agent, but he is what I consider the last land agent of the golden era of the landed estates, he became a land agent in the early 1870s. He remained a land agent until about 1939. So he had a huge career. He lived through the Land War, the Plan of Campaign, the uprising in 1916, World War I, the Civil War, the War of Independence, and the beginning of World War II. So he had a huge career spanning over, I suppose, 7 decades. He was originally from Carlow, just outside Carlow town, and his family are a branch of the Rochfort family from County Westmeath. We would associate them with Belvedere House. So they've been in the country for, I think, about the 12th century, so they're pretty well established throughout the country, and at this stage the family have more or less died out. I haven't come across any of the family in Ireland. Any contact I've had with descendants of the family, they've been in Canada. So not a lot of attention has been given to land agents as a profession. Some land agents didn't have a very good reputation. We're all might be familiar with this statement that landlords were sometimes decent men and that their agents were devils one and all. And some land agents justifiably were devils. There's a few that come to mind. I can think of George Sands, who was regarded as the terror of North Kerry. You had William Stuart Trench and his son John Townsend Trench, who was born in Sopwell Hall. They have left a legacy in Kerry and other places that has persisted to this day. But who were the land agents and what qualified them to become land agents? And it's important that we know that they needed the right background, they needed to be well socially connected, they needed to be able to, I suppose, walk the walk and talk the talk with the landowners. So a lot of the landowners were from the higher echelons of British society that would have had land here. And so they needed to know how to interact and they needed to know what the social norms were in that society. They needed to have the right education. So an awful lot of land agents would have gone to school maybe in Eton or other places. They would have gone to college in Oxford or Trinity College. And they would have gone to college and school with a lot of the people that they ended up working for. Those with a profession were particularly in demand, particularly from the 1840s onwards. A lot of land agents who were appointed at one point, as Des Murnan has written about a land agent, Holmes over in Capawhite. He was appointed, as he said, without much parley, without much talk. But from the 1840s onwards, those who had a profession or were professionals were really in demand. In particular, solicitors, accountants, and those with a military background. I suppose, how does William Rochfort fit into all of those? Well, he had the right background. The Rochfort family were very well connected. They were minor gentry. His father, Horace, up here pictured on the top right-hand side, he was quite a well-known character. He'd been brought up in London and would have been very comfortable mingling with members of Parliament because his aunt's husband, who had raised him, was an MP. He had married, his first wife was a lady called Frances Cosby, Many of us would be familiar with Stradbally Hall, where Electric Picnic is held every summer. She died in the mid-1840s, and he remarried. This is Horatio Mann down here in the end. This would have been Horace's grandfather. He was the founding member of Marylebone Cricket Club. Many of us would know it as Lords today. Apparently, his enthusiasm for cricket far outstripped his ability to play cricket. But he's important because he would have had the connections. Gentry liked cricket, and a lot of them played it, so he would have had that connection. This is the next connection with Rochfort. His father married for a second time. He married a lady called Charlotte Hood. Now, I wasn't able to find a photograph of Charlotte Hood, but I did find a photograph of her mother, and her name was Charlotte Nelson Hood. She was the third Duchess of Bronte. She had a very famous granduncle, one Lord Horatio Nelson, and she actually ended up inheriting Nelson's estate. Nelson had no legitimate heirs, and the estate passed to his brother, who was Charlotte's father, and she ended up inheriting his estate. So we can see the connections that Rochfort had. He was seriously connected. Just in case anybody is wondering, the Duchy of Bronte is in Sicily, and Nelson was granted the duchy by the Italian government, and the estate remained in the descendants of the Hood family up until relatively recent years. It's now in the ownership of the Italian government. Rochfort had all of these connections. He was well brought up. This is the home that he was brought up in. Unfortunately, it's in ruins today. So he wouldn't have been overwhelmed going in to visit any of the houses of the gentry that he was associated with. And just to give you an idea of the extent of what size the home was, it had 52 rooms, which included 30 bedrooms, a large ballroom, 33 fireplaces, 365 panes of glass, and in the early 1800s, it cost £32,000 to build. It actually nearly broke the family financially. Rochfort was also very familiar with the running of his father's estate. He would have known how to walk the walk and talk the talk. He was familiar with the running of the estate. He also, like his famous uncle, joined the military. And during that time, he was actually stationed in Clonmel for a period of time. It was also during that time that he received his training as a surveyor. He received engineering training, which was particularly useful when he became a land agent. He resigned his commission from the army in 1872, and he set about setting himself up as a land agent at that point. His offices were based in the home place in Clongrennan in County Carlow, and latterly when he got married, he moved into Carlow town to Burren House. Now, and if anybody is familiar with the centre of Carlow, this house is located right in the centre of Carlow. It's actually located very close to St. Patrick's College, and for many years it was used for student accommodation. It's in private ownership at the moment. So once he established himself in Carlow as a land agent, the first thing he set about doing was finding clients or people who wanted to take him on. And one of the first people who took him on was this gentleman here, the 5th Marquis of Lansdowne, William Henry Petty Fitzmaurice. He was a descendant of William Petty, who did the Down Survey, as we know, back in the mid-17th century. He took on Rochfort. He considered Rochfort to be a very clever man. From about 1873, he appointed him sub-agent on Laois and Offaly, or the Kings and Queens County estates, and he also did the books for the estate. So he did the accounts for the estate. They were held in Rochfort's office in Carlow. Then, and at that particular time when Lansdowne took him on, Lansdowne was the second largest landowner in Ireland. He had land in Kerry, Laois, Offaly and County Meath. Probably other small pockets, but that's where his main land holdings were. He then got another high-profile employer, and that was Lord Hoath. Oh, the reason I have Annerville here is because this is outside Clonmel. One of the Petty Fitzmaurices married into Annerville, and it's actually where the 6th Marquis of Lansdowne died in 1932 on his way to the estate in Kerry. So Lord Hoath employed Lansdowne from about 1876 onwards, and those two estates, he remained as an agent on the Lansdowne estate until the mid-1930s, and he remained on the Hoath estate until at least the mid-1920s. I'm not sure whether he extended further than that. in all probability he did, but I just haven't found evidence. The Howth papers are still in private ownership, so they're not that easy to access. So he had two fairly high-profile ones. He then, in 1882, he moved to Cahir in County Tipperary after he took over the agency of the Cahir Chartist Estate. The Cahir Chartist Estate, we would associate it more with Cahir Castle. At that time, he also took over the agencies of the Hankey Estate, Lady Emily Hankey's estate, which was outside Cahir at Knockgraffon. He took over the Spring Rice Estate. He took over the Lord Stanhope's estates in Laois and Kilkenny. There was a few other estates. He was actually from the mid-1880s. He was the agent on the Matthew estate here in Thurles. And I'm not sure the dates, but he was definitely here in the mid-1880s. And he also took over, there was a few other estates, smaller estates that he took over at that time. And I'll show you a list of the estates in a minute. So this is another one, another Tipperary one. I don't know if anybody recognises this. This is Ballygoran House, just outside Clonmel in 1889. He took over this estate. And it was interesting because we have the letter that was sent to him asking him would he take over the estate. And in the letter, I think it was Major Watson wrote, and he said that my estate is so many acres in so many parishes in Tipperary, and the rental income is so much from that. And the reason he was giving the rental income at that particular point was because land agents got paid a percentage of the rent that they collected. It averaged about 5%, but it depended on the estate. On the Howth estate, we know that he got paid 2.5% of the rental income. We don't know on the Lansdowne estate. It's probably, if he was paid the same as his predecessors, William Stewart Trench, it was probably about 5%. On the Hankey estate, he got 5% until times got very tough in the 1920s, and then it was increased to 7%. The income reduced, and the percentage he was paid of the income increased. In 1892, he took over the agency of the Shanbally estate, which we would know locally as the Shanbally estate. I call it the Lismore O'Callaghan estate because it obviously extended outside of Tipperary into Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. By 1890, he had a pretty good portfolio of properties that he was agent on. So, to date, these are only some of the estates that I have identified. I've actually identified well over 20 estates, mainly in what we call now in Munster and Leinster, but he also was involved with an estate up in County Derry. I suspect he was actually involved with more estates, but until more information, and hopefully with the Land Commission records come, we'll get more information at that particular point. But they're the estates that he was an agent on, mainly based in County Tipperary. But I just want to bring your attention to this estate here, the Going estate in Ballyphilip. Benjamin Going died in about 1883, and Rochfort was appointed by the High Court as receiver of that estate. He was also appointed as the guardian of the Going children. There were two small children, and Mrs. Going was pregnant with her third child. So he was appointed as their guardian as well. He was visiting, they lived in Ballyphilip House, just out, I think it's near Killinall, and while he was visiting there in 1891, he was shot. It's the only time I found an example of where he was attacked. He was inside in the dining room, and somebody shot him, fired a shot in through the dining room window, and he was injured in the arm, but he didn't make anything of it. So that's just a map, just to give you a kind of a representation of the geographical spread. I don't have County Derry included because I had this map made before I realised that he was involved with up in County Derry. But I find it hard to believe that he wasn't involved with estates in Wicklow and Kildare. I suspect he was. I just haven't found evidence of that yet to date. So as you can see from the slide, the estates are spread through the provinces of Munster and Leinster. And we have to wonder, how did he manage to manage all of these estates? Because there's such a large geographical spread. Well, one of I suppose the primary way he did is he established a well-managed and structured estate agency office. and he built a trusted network of support staff. And these provided various services across several estates. So you might have had one employee on maybe the Watson estate, and that employee might have been on the Chartist estate and the Hankey estate. So you would have had the same people employed across several estates. And the network, I would argue, was pivotal at times in ensuring that Rochfort was kept informed of any issues which may have had the potential to have a negative impact on not only him, but on the landlord, or in particular, the income of the estate. It's possible this network was the key to William Rochfort's longevity as a relatively successful land agent. So from 1882, as I said, he had his office in Cahir, where the main office was in Cahir House Hotel, which is now. And he also had a land agents training academy in that office. So he trained up potential land agents. And it took about 8 to 10 years to go through the training process there. His Dublin office also served as the Howth Estate office. And in London, he had an office in London. It kind of was a movable feast. He used at times the headquarters of the Irish Loyal and Patriotic Union at 68 Pall Mall, and there were other addresses that he used. But from looking at across all the archives and all the papers, we can actually build up a picture of the I suppose the administrative structure in the office. At the apex were the various landlords that Rochfort reported to. Rochfort was reporting directly to the landlords. Most of the estate staff would not have reported directly to the landlords. It would have all been channeled through Rochfort. He had sub-agents. Not all the agents were based in the office in Cahir. You had an agent maybe based in Kenmare. You would have had an agent in the Dublin office at all times, and in various other estates throughout the country. The accountant was based in Cahir, and from very, very many years, the accountant in the Cahir office was a gentleman called William Sutcliffe, and there are descendants of the Sutcliffe family still down in the south of the county. The accountant was responsible for the actual running of the office, so all the office clerks, the cleaning staff, all of that would have reported directly to him. You would have had various bailiffs, like water bailiffs. There was various bailiffs employed. You would have had surveyors. You might have had solicitors. You also had this group of men who were the rent warners, and they've been kind of largely forgotten about. And they can be very difficult to research because sometimes people call them bailiffs. But these were the people who lived in the localities. So you would have had rent warners down in various areas in Cork, in Limerick. You would have had them around Kilcommon in Cahir. There was out in Clogheen. There would have been down in Killusty. There would have been more up in Lisnatubrat. So they would have been spread out. And they would have actually acted as a conduit for information to go through to Rochfort estate. You would often find mention of tenants writing to Rochfort and saying, will you ask the rent warner, he'll tell you what I'm telling you is true. Or sometimes you'd have, they'd use them they'd pay the rent to the rent warner, or they'd get the rent warner to actually write to the land agent for them. And at times you would have William Rochfort writing to the rent warner saying, will you go out and find out this information for me and report back to me. So they were really, really important group of people. Sometimes they were accepted in their localities, and sometimes, particularly during the land war, they were seen as the public face of estates, and they were often attacked. So this is a picture that's available on the National Library website. It's taken in 1902, so it was a year before the Wyndham Land Act, the 1903 Land Act. This is William Rochfort here. This is his wife, Helen Blanche Palmer here. This gentleman, a Swiss banker who was based in London, and he was renting a castle from Lord Kenmare down in Kerry. So Rochfort, he came up for a day's shooting to Cahir Abbey. I think these two must be estate employees, but this gentleman here, this gentleman here, this gentleman here, and this gentleman here, they were all sub-agents based in the office. And how do we know that? Because they've signed them. So you have Hinckley up here, you have Armstrong, you have Cole Baker, and you have a gentleman here called Albert Oscar Hood. So they were all sub-agents based in the Cahir office. But just to say, just to pick out this, if I'm correct, and I'm taking them as they have, as they're named, this man here should be Albert Oscar Hood. He was actually Rochfort's second cousin. He was an Englishman. He came over in the 1890s, and around 1907, when John Townsend Trench resigned his agency of the Carysford estate in Wicklow, Albert Oscar Hood became the land agent on that estate. He then, in 1912, married Lord Lansdowne's niece. Everard Digby was her father, so they would have been the Digbys that were you'd find in County Offaly. They had large estates in County Offaly, and in 1920 he was offered the I suppose a senior agent's position, running Lansdowne's estate in Wiltshire, and himself and his wife moved to Wiltshire, and they remained there for the rest of their lives. So this is a part of the networking that was going on as well. This guy Hinckley, which I'm assuming is here, he was a guy from Somerset, and his family were very heavily connected with cricket. There was also another gentleman who's not photographed here, A.E. Newton, and I'll mention him in a few minutes, but he was a very famous British cricketer. He had played for Oxford and for Eton, and he had gone on tour into Australia. And what's interesting about A.E. Newton is that we know he played cricket while he was here in his time in Cahir, but it would appear that at times he went back to England to play cricket. So it would seem that Rochfort sent him to work in England and to do whatever work with various estates in England or the landlords. And he also got the opportunity to play cricket because I've checked with the British Cricket Historians Association, and they have mention of him playing there. They actually were very surprised to find out that he was in Ireland for so long. They didn't realise that. So one of the legacies of William Rochfort are the letters and the communications that he has with the tenants. And you can find those in various archives strewn throughout the country and in England. Most of the letters that exist, some of them are copies of letters that are copied into the estate letter book. Some are just little bits of paper, and they're fragmented. But they do tell us a story about social life. Like, for instance, on the Hoth estate, you have one of the tenants writing to say, which will resonate with many farmers today, that she was locked up. That all her animals were in quarantine. So things haven't changed from the mid-1880s today. We still have farmers who were locked up, whose animals are locked up and they can't move them. And she was found herself in that situation, and she couldn't move her animals, so she couldn't sell them, so she couldn't pay her rent. Somebody else had animals dying, and they died from hydrophobia. I'm presuming everybody knows hydrophobia is rabies. But within 20 years of that letter being written, rabies was totally eradicated in Ireland. So they had different diseases to encounter than what we had today. So one of the best collections of letters that exist are from the Shanbally estate, and they date from 1892 to 1902. And that time period is really important. It hasn't been studied that much, and it's coming after the Plannet campaign. I know the Plannet campaign was still rumbling on in some estates, but for the most part it had died out. So you've got in the post-Plannet campaign, and they finish in 1902, which is the year before Wyndham's 1903 Land Act, when the tenants could buy out their holdings under that act. One of the first estates to be sold under that Land Act was the Cork and Kerry estate of the Lismore estate, or the Shanbally estate. So they give us a unique insight into what things were troubling tenants, what social issues were going on, and what the various concerns were. So this is the area we have in the collection, and I'll put a photograph up of it in a minute. It's divided into two parts. You have two rent ledgers, one that covers South County Limerick and North Cork, this Bantir, Kanturk area, and around Fahona. And strangely in that collection is a group of tenants from just outside Roscrea, around Roscrea Golf Club, including, say, Victor Mitchell, where his auction rooms are. There's a Victor Mitchell in it, so I'm presuming or assuming that he's related to the current Mitchells. And the other one covers South Tipperary, mainly North Care around Ballydrihid, over around Feathered and over around Clusty, kind of down down as far as Kilsheelan, that kind of area. So they're the tenant books. There are some in it that cover Feathered Town, some entries in it that cover Feathered Town, and there are some entries in it that cover Clonmel as well, but the vast majority are from the rural areas. They are accompanied by 800 pieces of correspondence from the tenants in those areas. Now, not all the tenants have sent letters, and not all the letters match up with tenants in the letter book or in the ledgers. So it leads me to presume or assume that there was also other ledgers that have been destroyed and are no longer exist. The ledgers, these are the ledgers. They're divided into two parts. The first part is this: all the tenants are listed by alphabet, so they're in alphabetical order. You've got the A's, B's, C's, and D's, and then the second half is they're arranged alphabetically by townland. The page, they're difficult. They're actually quite awkward to look at and to handle. But they have the tenant's name, what rent he was paying. They'd also note any changes, the area in statute acres, the townland, how long the tenancy was for. You have them from a yearly tenancy up to 500 years. So there's that kind of a spread. Then they note the gale day when the rent was paid, things like poor rate, how much was actually paid, any outstanding arrears. Now, most tenants will be in arrears because there was the hanging gale at that stage where you didn't pay rent for the first 6 months and then your rent fell due. But over here on the extreme right is a column called Observations. And that's where Rochfort noted observations about the tenants, whether they got abatements, whether they got an allowance for death, whether they got an allowance to build a house, whether they had promised to pay their rent and didn't pay their rent, all sorts of things. And very often you'll find it up here in the top as well. The notations up here also include details about people's physical appearance, about their political allegiance, about whether they pay rent to any other landlord. They would also note whether there was other incomes coming from other people. So if you had a few sons living with you, whether they were working, whether they were contributing, whether there was any other under tenants. So there's lots and lots of detail there. The letters would include letters and observations from the rent warners. They would include letters from tenants with reasons why they couldn't pay their rent. They would include letters telling Rochfort when he was wrong, when he had made a mistake. They include letters reporting activities of their neighbours. So a whole host of things. Many of the files just contain rent receipts, and some of them rent demands. So you never know what you're going to find when you open one of the files. And they're all written on various scraps of paper. And some of them are beautifully written in copperplate writing. Some of them are on beautiful headed paper. And we can identify the age range of the people who have written the letters. The youngest letter writer was 17-year-old Nora O'Sullivan from Banteer in County Cork, and the oldest people were well into their 80s when they wrote. So there's that kind of an age spread of people. One of the most common reasons that people wrote to Rochfort was when they were looking for additional time to pay their rent. The reasons that they gave that they were unable to pay their rents included illness, death, an inability to sell produce in stock due to poor economic or weather conditions. And these letters were actually still these letters were written while there was still a recession. There had been a recession a global recession had started in the late 1870s and continued for about 20 years. And there, as I said, there was others. What these letters do is they allow us to build up a social history of various places at that particular time. And it also helps to give a voice to people from the past. I like to think it gives a character, and it helps to people the past is a good phrase. So many of the reasons that people were unable to pay their rent will resonate with people today. And I'm just going to outline two different people who couldn't pay their rent and the reason why they couldn't pay their rent. The first one is Brian O'Donnell from Ballydrihid in County Tipperary, and that's his letter to Rochfort in May 1893. And he wrote to Rochfort and I quote, "to apologise for trespassing on your kindness, as he would not be in a position to pay his rent till he sold his hay about the end of July." He went on to explain to Rochfort that he had a large young family entirely depending on me and trying hard to keep some of them to school and clothing. I have a hard lot to contend with. Kate and Brian had 12 young children, and the desire to keep the children in school was seen as a way out of poverty. It also had the advantage that if any of the children emigrated, that there was a good chance that they would gain good employment rather than if they were illiterate. Things did not improve for poor Brian, and again in 1895 he wrote to Rochfort asking him to indulge him for a little longer to pay his rent. The stress of keeping his large family and paying his rent eventually caught up with Brian O'Donnell, and he died in 1909, aged 59 years. I should add that he did get extensions to pay his rent. Now, this is another case, and I'm going to just start off by saying, when you look at this, you'll see that this gentleman down here has signed his name John Greer. Well, if he did, John Greer was also known as John Green, John Greed, and various other spellings. I call him John Greed because it's the spelling that's in the rent ledger, and that's the one that I stick with. So Andrew Greed, he was from Killusty, was left with a family of 10 to raise following the death of his wife Mary in 1885. And within a few years, he found himself struggling with significant rent arrears. He had quite large rent arrears. Greed, Rochfort noted, was a very old man, and he lived at home with his adult unmarried children, a daughter and 3 sons. By this stage, the rest of the family had emigrated to the States. The sons, Rochfort noted in his ledger, were drinkers and did not help their father. The information from Richard Ryan, who was a local rent warner from Killusty, conflicts somewhat with Rochfort's notes on the family, and this is a report that was done on the family. Ryan reported that Andrew Greed's problems were caused by his eldest son, Ned, a drinker who had broken him. And as a result of the problems caused by Ned, the rest of the family who lived at home had nothing to do with him. Owing nearly £50 in rent, ejectment proceedings were served on Andrew Greed in December 1893. The family moved out of the family home. However, Greed kept 10 sheep, a horse and a cow there every day following his eviction, according to Pat Ryan, another local rent warner who was from Lisnatubret. He had inspected the property before Rochfort held a meeting with the family to discuss their readmittance to the house and land. Sub-agent A.E. Newton, in his report to Rochfort on the family's circumstances, had consulted both Pat Ryan and Pat Ryan and Richard Ryan. As noted above, Richard Ryan did not give Ned Greed a favourable report. However, both rent warners gave favourable comments on the younger sons, John and Thomas. John, they reported, was a hard-working, steady boy, never drinks, sold 25 sheep lately and has the price of them. And he was in employment with a Mr. Shea from Killusty South, and he lived there. His brother Thomas had savings, and like John, he also had a steady job, and he was prepared to live at home and look after their father. And as I said, the rest of the family at this stage had gone to the States. Despite Richard Ryan's misgivings that he did not know if they would be able to prevent the eldest brother, Ned, from breaking them, as he appears to have broken their father, Rochfort decided to offer John Ryan a yearly tenancy upon the payment of a fine of £10. Perhaps it was the revelation that John had money readily available to pay the rent, or the fact, as noted in the report, that the holding is a wretched one and quite unattractive to any outsider, that prompted Rochfort to make the offer. However, Rent warner Richard Ryan's disquiet about the ability of the brothers to pay their rent proved correct, and the Greed family again found themselves ejected in 1896. They were readmitted again following a payment of another fine of £10. And that seems to be a trend. If you were threatened with ejectment, you tended to pay a fine and proceedings went away, or you paid law costs. After suffering from senile decay for several years, which may have affected which may have contributed to his inability to pay his rent, Andrew Greed died in Clonmel Workhouse in January 1897. Just in case any of you are wondering how the brothers fared after they were readmitted, from the notes that Rochfort made in the ledger, the brothers applied to him for an allowance to do up the house that they were living in, and it was granted. And the work must have been a relatively good job, because in 1903, John got married, and Thomas got married in 1917. John had no children, and Thomas had one son, Christopher, who was born in 1918, and he died in 1938. And the family's connection with the area was severed in 1967 when Thomas's widow, Bridget, sold their holding. So that's where Rochfort used the rent warners to get information about the family, and they were able to come to an agreement to leave the family on the holding. And you do come across that Rochfort tended to try and keep people on a holding rather than try and get new people in. It was easier for the continuity to have somebody. Now, that's not to say that he didn't evict people, he most certainly did, but you do find incidents of that where he did try to keep families on holdings. In his obituary, the author noted that Rochfort dealt with tens of thousands of tenants throughout his career, and that he had a remarkable memory. One of the ways in which Rochfort remembered these tenants was through the use of notations and mnemonics in the tenants' rent ledgers and sometimes in the estate letter books. And these can be particularly useful for the family historian or any of us who are researching our families, as they give a character to the people who otherwise might only exist on a name on a page. And some examples of these are, the first page are from Ballydrihid. So you have Andrew Barrett, who was a little old man who stoops. Mary Nugent was a white-haired old woman. Matt Martin was a good tenant, whereas John Peters had a bad record. James Keating was a little old man with grey whiskers, and Mary Houlihan was a widow for 14 years. She had 2 sons, one who had a weak intellect. Pat Kavanagh, his rent was paid by his sister Mary. Con Ryan from Lisnatubret, his father was Thomas Ryan, who had no teeth. And Martin Power from Lisnatubret had sons in the Metropolitan Police, and one makes a poor mouth. Now, they don't mention whether it's the Dublin Metropolitan Police or the London Metropolitan Police. John Ahern was a short, dark man with blue eyes, and John Schofield had a public house on Main Street in Feathered, and he was quite well to do. So you do find all of these notations, and you'll find notations in letter books where they might comment that somebody is awkward to deal with, or he does note sometimes whether somebody likes a drop of whiskey or if they don't drink. So you've got a whole range of things that he makes comment on. I would argue that this is a wonderful legacy for anybody, and it could actually give us a sense of what was happening throughout the country, because there are similarities between what was happening in Cork and Limerick and in Tipperary. There were differences, but there were also similarities. But he also had some other legacies, and some of these which might be more familiar to us today. In actual fact, most of us probably come in contact at least once during our lives with the next 2 that I'm going to talk about. At the beginning of the 20th century, this gentleman, George Wyndham, was appointed as Chief Secretary of Ireland. And among other things he was very keen to do was to solve the Irish land question. Following defeat of his first proposed Land Act in 1902, the Irish Land Aid Owners Committee, of which William Rochfort was a member, he was a landowner, he had land himself down outside Clare. At the land conference in November 1902, the members of that land conference voted to enter into talks to agree what would eventually end up being the terms of the 1903 Land Act, which would allow tenant farmers to buy their holdings. Didn't include tenants in urban areas. I think that situation went on until the 1970s. I certainly know in my family it did. At the same time, as well as being a member of the Land Owners Committee, William Rochfort was also a member of the Land Agents Committee. And the Land Agents Committee was a subcommittee that was formed under the umbrella of the Surveyors Institute. And they were very fearful, the land agents were very fearful, that if the 1903 Land Act was passed in the form that it was initially proposed, that they would be out of work overnight, that they would have no jobs. They had been trying for a number of years to get professional recognition by the courts, the land courts, and they had no legal standing under any of the previous Land Acts. They weren't actually entitled for any payment from the courts. They might have done all the work organising for lands and estates to be sold under those particular Land Acts through the courts, but when it came for getting payment, they weren't entitled to get anything, and they didn't get anything from the courts. They may have come to a private arrangement with the landowners, but they didn't get anything from the land courts. So Rochfort had been a member of the Land Agents Committee from the mid to late 1890s, and in April 1903, he was appointed as chair of that committee. And the first thing that he did was he invited Justice Ross from the land courts to their annual dinner. Now, Ross had been invited previous times to that, but he had refused to attend because he felt that he couldn't attend while at the same time he was reducing the income of the land agents by clearing the estates. But on this occasion, he accepted the invitation because he felt duty-bound, he said, to be there that particular year, to acknowledge the profession, which was, and I quote, as difficult a profession of any other, that required great skill. The credit for the clearing out of his court of so many estates was largely due to the land agents of Ireland, who had done that work unselfishly and most skillfully. Although in his position, Ross was precluded from making any political statements, in his after-dinner speech, he said that it was his personal opinion that the land agents deserved to receive appropriate compensation under the proposed bill. The land agents also had the support of some of the Irish landowners who sat in Parliament, and presumably as these men recognised that they needed the skills of the land agents when it came to selling their holdings under the Act. The land agents probably knew their estates, the running of their estates, better than the landlords, and they also knew where all the skeletons were buried. Rochfort, who Lord Howth proclaimed to be the champion of all the poor land agents, spent much of that summer in London canvassing for support to include amendments to the Act for compensation for the land agents. And indeed, Lord Howth comments at one stage that he couldn't possibly bother Rochfort with some details in connection with his estate. He was just far, far too busy. When the Act was passed by Parliament on the 10th of August 1903, it contained two unexpected clauses. And these clauses had actually been, Rochfort had lobbied, and he had gotten the Earl of Devonshire and the Earl of Donaghmore, Healy Hutchinson. Healy Hutchinson was from Knocklofty House, and the Devonshire was married to a niece, I think it was a niece of 5th Marquis. So they had a connection. So they got these under Section 23, they got subsections 11 and 12 in. And this is the first time in Ireland that land agents are entitled to negotiate the sale of land and to get paid a percentage of the sale price for their trouble. The money was to be paid by the seller as opposed to the purchaser, because sometimes up to that you had to pay to get your interest in a holding. This was the first time that this had happened. And with the insertion of these, which followed, and it did follow intense lobbying, I would argue that the modern Irish estate agency was born, because up to this, and we still call them estate agents today, land agents, estate agents, they didn't exist in the form that we know them today before the 1903 Land Act. One of the other things, what the Land Act doesn't specify how much commission that they're supposed to get paid. And once Rochfort had finished with this, then they had to go into negotiations to agree a payment. The Land Act was supposed to be enacted or come into being on the 1st of November, and in late October they came to an agreement that the land agents would get paid 3% of the sale price and the land clerks would get paid 0.5% of the sale price. I did a bit of a ring around and a bit of a Google search. Land agents today, or estate agents today, charge between 1% and 3%, depending on the search. So it hasn't changed an awful lot since the 1903 Land Act, and that's where that percentage comes from. Rochfort also left us another legacy. In the early years of the 20th century, I suppose he saw that the writing was on the wall in terms of the large landed estates. Rochfort took up a new career as an insurance man. So he became a director of the branch of Norwich Union Assurance Society, and the earliest reference I can find to that is from the Kerry Reporter in 1903. In 1915, he was appointed to the Irish Board of Directors of the overarching Norwich Union business in Ireland, and he remained a director of Norwich Union until his death in 1940. He died in September 1940, and he was re-elected onto the board, or reappointed onto the board in the spring of 1940. So Norwich Union doesn't exist in Ireland as a name but we would know it more as Aviva Insurance. And as you can see, the logo is the same. So while many of us may never heard the name of William Rochfort, and in actual fact the only two places that people really know the name of William Rochfort are in Cahir and Kenmare, and you get a very different response between the two places when you mention his name. And it would seem that he never wanted the limelight during his lifetime. His legacies, albeit unintended ones, live on in the estate records, which reveal so much about the lives of our ancestors, and at times their personality and physical traits, the modern Irish estate agency business, and in the company Aviva Insurance, which many of us may come in contact with at least once during our lifetime. So thank you.